Skies of Arcadia is everything a JRPG should be, from its cast of memorable and uplifting characters to its vast and open world set in the lands above the sky. It's the definition of pure adventure as you band together with your gang of sky pirates to discover the great unknowns of the world. Releasing back in the year 2000 on the Sega Dreamcast, Skies of Arcadia, which is known as Eternal Arcadia in Japan, was one of the final games to be released on that system before Sega left the console market and became a third-party developer. If you wasn't aware, before Sega left the console scene for good, they was pushing hard to release high quality games to bring audiences over to the Dreamcast. This system didn't go out of a whimper, but an absolutely glorious explosion when it came to its incredible library of games. Sega was developing some of the most ambitious titles ever made at the time, such as the grandfather of narrative gaming, Shenmue, which had a budget of $70 million, which was unheard of back in the late 90s. Needless to say, Sega was bringing their absolute A-game with the Dreamcast and was given their role to stay afloat. When it came to Skies of Arcadia, development originally started on this title on the Saturn but quickly shifted to the Dreamcast and was comprised of many different development teams who also made Phantasy Star, Sakura Wars and even the first two Sonic the Hedgehog games. Getting into the game itself, we start above the clouds at night time as we see this mysterious girl riding away in her aircraft as she's being pursued by this commander named Alfonso. After seeing her be knocked unconscious, we then cut to aboard Alfonso's ship and are introduced to our main protagonist, Vice. Him and his companion, Icar, are known as air pirates who plunder only from the rich and welfare and never to those less fortunate. An easy to understand Robin Hood style of morality. Anyway, after breaking in on board Alfonso's ship, we begin the tutorial battle. We'll be taking a thorough, more in-depth look at the combat in this video a little later, but things are very beginner friendly and easy to understand when it comes to the battle system in Skies of Arcadia. After further investigating the airship, we catch up to Alfonso and best his defences, forcing him to flee and leave his ship behind, which allows our air pirates and their crew to plunder what's on board alongside saving this mysterious girl who got caught up in it all. We then cut to the next day, and after waking up and passing introductions, it turns out that her name is Fina and she's a part of an Asian civilization known as the Sylvites. And we also find out that Ica and Vice are a part of an air pirate gang which is known as the Blue Rogues and is led by Vice's dad. After returning to Vice's hometown and getting his father's approval on trusting Fina's backstory, as well as offering to help her, we are then introduced to the concept of moonstones in this game's world. Similar to mana or materia in other games, moonstones are what's used in battles and are a very valuable resource in the world of Arcadia. Anyway, Vice and Icar notice one crash land in an area nearby and decide to investigate the ruins. They leave together, and it's during this time that their hometown is plundered by the main antagonist of this game, that being the Valuan Empire. They burn your hometown to the ground and kidnap Fina once again, alongside imprisoning the rest of the Blue Rogues who are now scheduled to be executed after what we did at the start of the game. Thankfully, no one is seriously hurt as you inspect the remains of the carnage, and it's here where Vice and Icar set off to save Fina by heading to the Empire of Valua to bring her back. One small aspect I'd like to mention about Skies of Arcadia before continuing with its plot is with this game's art style. Even when looking at this title today, the early 3D diorama look to everything is incredibly charming. There's also just something about Skies of Arcadia's aesthetic that really reminded me of the cancelled Earthbound 64 game that never saw the light of day. You can even look around in first person to further soak in this incredible sky world. The lack of any intrusive UI on screen is also very much appreciated. Most JRPGs around this time, especially on the PlayStation 1, use pre-rendered graphics, which whilst charming, I find that the full use of 3D in Skies of Arcadia is definitely more impressive on a technical level, and makes the game stand out way more than other JRPGs when it comes to its visuals. Anyway, so after leaving your hometown, Vice and Ica find themselves in a strong storm and eventually go overboard and lose their boat. But thankfully, they are saved by a man named Drachma who has an artificial arm. He allows us to use his aircraft in a mutual partnership, and after stocking up on supplies alongside fighting off other sky pirates, we make our way to Valua. It's a bit of a dump and is an island where classes are split up between the wealthy and poor, and also has this dystopian colour palette. It's at this moment where I realise that this game takes a lot of inspiration from Final Fantasy VII. It's an aspect to this title that the developers have definitely acknowledged as inspiration. Similarities such as Drachma having an artificial arm like Barret, alongside Fina being part of an Asian civilization like Aerith, or the Empire of Valua being similar to Midgar with how it treats its citizens, are definitely not so subtle nods to Final Fantasy VII. All of this makes sense when you consider how Final Fantasy VII was really making waves back in the late 90s, and is pretty much responsible for making JRPGs successful in the West and garnering an audience in the first place. Skies of Arcadia is definitely much more than just an inspiration birthed from Final Fantasy VII, and in some ways is a step up from that classic, but it's important to at least acknowledge just how much influence that title had on both gaming and pop culture at the time. Anyway, so after investigating the sewers of Valua, Weiss, Icar and Dragmar find a way into the Colosseum to save the Blue Rogues from being executed. Afterwards, Weiss and Icar jump on board a train, and through a thrilling railroad breakout they manage to save Fenar, who was on board. They hold their own against the Empire and just in the nick of time manage to escape thanks to Dragmar, who was on board his ship. Once we save Fenar and blast our way out of Valua, it's here where the game starts to open up as we're given our general plot structure for Skies of Arcadia with our main objective. Basically, long ago, ancient civilizations each relied on their own moonstones for power over one another. There are 6 moonstones in total, and each of them can awaken their own Gygus, which is pretty much a guardian that is capable of mass destruction. Fenar was sent to find these moonstones since the Valuan Empire are also after them for world domination. And with the general gist of our journey established, you set out to find these 6 moonstones, all whilst fighting against the Valuan Empire. If I was to compare this JRPG to any other when it comes to its narrative, I would say that story-wise it's very similar to a lot of the Dragon Quest games. There's still this motivation and drive to see what happens next, but things are intentionally left simple to focus more on the scope and adventure of this world that you're about to explore. It's just one of the many amazing examples out there of taking the journey over the actual destination itself approach. And as you go on this grand adventure, you'll bump into different arcs and see the characters interacting with one another. The story itself balances a fine line of being light-hearted but also tackling some sensitive subjects in its own bright and cheery way. I always respect when writers were able to pull this off without coming off as tone-deaf or insensitive. It's the kind of narrative you can really relax around and let your guard down with. Let's take a look at the gameplay in Skies of Arcadia, or more specifically with how it goes about its unique combat system. The battle system in Skies of Arcadia is amazing and manages to shape things up for a genre that is more traditional in how it goes about combat. For instance, similar to something like Final Fantasy VIII, no party member fulfills a specific role and can each learn the same magic moves through battling and gaining experience. However, unlike Final Fantasy VIII where this approach ended up making party members all feel the exact same, in Skies of Arcadia party members are still given enough differences with their base stats and how they each have different S moves to give them more of an identity when it comes to playing as each one. Each enemy has a specific elemental weakness and you can change the colour of your weapon using moonstones to take advantage of this. On top of that, relying on the same colour will result in your character learning the magic type associated with it. For instance, using a lot of green wind elemental attacks will result in you learning healing arts, which is very useful early on in this game. I really like this mechanic since it doesn't directly punish the player for not always using the most optimal attack that deals the most amounts of damage, and instead rewards different playstyles. Like if you're the kind of player who wants to prioritise only using a certain colour to unlock a specific magical move, you can do that. Another aspect to this battle system that's unique is how you go about spending your resources. This might sound a little confusing at first, but every magic move in this game only costs 1 MP no matter how strong it is. However, at the top of the screen you'll see your SP bar. This determines your team's overall spirit gauge and is what's spent to actually be able to use the move itself. Every character during combat can charge this gauge, it's a shared resource, and you also receive SP at the start of each turn. Whilst sounding confusing, this combat system is actually very easy to pick up for newcomers. What I liked a lot about how battles are done using the shared SP gauge is how no party member feels useless. This is since you always have the option during every turn to increase this meter. If a character for whatever reason can't buff, heal or deal damage, they can still contribute by charging the SP gauge, which can only further benefit the team, allowing you to continuously use the strongest moves. Speaking of, finally you have your S moves. These are unique to each character and come with some nice visual flair and are your main methods of dealing damage. Weiss's S moves are focused on single target attacks and are typically the strongest, whilst Fenar's is centered more around healing and cleansing status effects. I found Icar's to be the most useful since her S moves are centered around AoE, so she is typically the quickest option to wipe out hordes of enemies in just one turn. Your 4th party member actually cycles through different characters and their moves can vary, but are typically centered around raw damage. But that's not all. What really separates Skies of Arcadia from your typical JRPG in terms of combat is how there are actual airship battles here. At first I was a little confused on how these battles are supposed to play out, but once I mastered the mechanics I actually found them to be quite fun. These aircrafts are also how you'll be fighting the different Geigers throughout your journey, and they can hit pretty hard. The way Skies of Arcadia implements airship fights definitely isn't for everyone due to its pacing. At the start of each turn, you'll be given an indication on how the fight will play out with this coloured grid. If it's green, you should play offensively, whilst red means you better heal up and defend. Once you've plotted your course, you pretty much sit back and watch the spectacle unfold. These fights are slow, but that's kind of the point. I'm pretty sure it's intended to feel like you're an audience member watching the action happen in real time like an anime or kaiju movie. At first, I wasn't a big fan of how long it took, but it grew on me over time. I'm also a big fan of how cinematic it all feels as you brace for impact hoping your airship doesn't explode or miss an attack. To further add to these more cinematic moments is the fact that throughout these battles, the game will present you with these choose your own adventure style options, allowing you to pick how you would like to act during a boss fight. I like how for the most part, the game doesn't punish your specific playstyle and instead allows you to act based on what you think is the right option. All of this really makes you feel like the captain of your own ship when it comes to choosing what you think is the best decision moving forward during a battle. This unique blend of combat really sets Skies of Arcadia apart from more traditional JRPGs that typically only have one method of battling, and is something that I really ended up liking and appreciating by the end of this experience. Speaking of, around the halfway point for Skies of Arcadia, Vice finally gets an airship of his own, and you even get to recruit other pirates to join you on your journey. Some of them can be added through side quests or by having your reputation increase so that the whole world knows who you are. Other pirates will also join you automatically as you progress through the story. The more pirates that you add to your crew results in more facilities opening up, and they can even help you in battle and grant passive buffs to your airship during combat. I absolutely love how Skies of Arcadia really makes you feel like a pirate. It's an aspect of the game that's done very well and still makes it feel unique from other JRPGs or really any other game in general when looking at this title today. How many gaming experiences out there allows you to become an actual sky pirate? In all honesty, I really wish Skies of Arcadia influenced more games out there. The unique world and sense of discovery that's on offer here is something that I feel like is missing in the modern state of game releases that seem to be more focused on realism when it comes to designing their settings. Anyway, looking more into the gameplay in Skies of Arcadia, you'll mostly be navigating open seas and exploring dungeons. Now, one of the more dated aspects of this title that you'll notice when looking at the game today is with just how many random encounters there are here. I don't mind them too much in the dungeon section specifically, since they tend to be less frequent and the game actually disables them when you're solving a puzzle, which I can definitely appreciate. I can't stand random encounters personally, but even worse is when you're trying to solve a puzzle and you keep entering a battle, which for me can be very disorientating. I usually end up just forgetting what I was even doing by the time the battle is over, and by the time I can remember the puzzle, I'm in another random encounter again. Memories of playing Octopath Traveler in particular gave me the most issues with this. Great game though. Anyway, whilst I can definitely appreciate them disabling encounters during puzzle sections, the airship exploration is where I feel like things can get a little too out of hand when it comes to the random encounter rate. Apparently, in the GameCube port for Skies of Arcadia, which released 3 years later, they tweaked the encounter rate, but personally, from my experience with it, encounters still felt a bit too frequent for my liking. But there is an advantage to this issue, and that is the fact that because of this, I was always on pace with anything the game had to throw at me challenge-wise. So outside of battling for money, grinding is practically non-existent in this game because of all the random encounters, which is at least a silver lining due to their abundance. Moving on from the combat, I'd like to talk about some of the individual characters since they really make up Skies of Arcadia as a whole. Vice, our main protagonist, has a very striking design in particular, which I'm a big fan of personally. He's your more traditional character type who just wants to explore the world around him whilst making new discoveries, and he does all this whilst keeping his courage alongside staying optimistic. Vice is definitely the kind of protagonist that you want in a game like this since he's always moving forward. The interactions and chemistry he has with his longtime friend Icar can also be very amusing to watch. They have some great moments together. This game can really feel like an anime at times with just how expressive everyone is. Looking back at when this title first released, there really wasn't any other JRPG like it when it came to just how many ranges of emotions the characters actually showed. This is since a lot of older releases look stilted outside the cutscenes, as well as always relying on the same camera angles, which further added to the lack of any expressive animation. Even JRPGs that I previously mentioned from this era like Threads of Fate, which I praised for showing more ranges of emotion than traditional titles on the system, was still heavily limited in what it could express due to being on the original PlayStation over the Dreamcast. Aika in particular is a great example of just how animated this game can be at times. She has a wide range of expressions, some of which I found pretty funny. Speaking of, when looking at Aika's design, it's very striking with how her hair is shaped to look like her primary weapon of choice, that being a boomerang, which is a nice touch. Once again, Skies of Arcadia just nails the pirate aesthetic as a whole. These designs are timeless. Capping off our main trio is Fina. She's more reserved at first, being from a different race to the rest of the characters, but quickly warms up to the cast. I'm a big fan of her pet, Kupal, who has a design ripped right out of the early 2000s, and I can't help but love it. Funnily enough, Kupal is Fina's weapon that can be used in battle, and you can collect items in the overworld to better strengthen him, which is pretty unique for a JRPG. Depending on certain criteria, he can change into different types of weapons and has a surprising amount of customization when going for different builds. I also just need to mention that whilst researching for this video, I came across this aftermarket plush for Kupal that is so derpy I just had to bring it up. Anyway, the main trio ensemble cast has a nice dynamic overall. You get to see more of Fina develop throughout the story, but Vice's undying optimism and Aika's more comic relief demeanour really allows for strong chemistry and interactions between the three flow nicely. They make for a great trio. Before capping off our journey through Skies of Arcadia, there's a few miscellaneous points that I'd like to bring up. I've touched a little on the version differences between the Dreamcast and GameCube releases of this game, but one other significant difference between these versions is with the musical score that Sega went with. The Dreamcast release back in the year 2000 had an orchestral soundtrack. Let me just point out how impressive that is for a game back then. To put this all into perspective, Nintendo wouldn't use orchestral music in their games until Mario Galaxy on the Wii in 2007, 2 console generations later. I've got to say as well, the soundtrack for Skies of Arcadia is just incredible and really brings the game's world to life. It's mesmerising at times and really immerses you in its sky aesthetic. It's definitely worth listening to in the background whilst doing something else, which is what I'll be doing whilst editing this video. Anyway, getting back on track, due to the more limited disc space of the GameCube, the orchestral music had to be downsized into MIDI files, which while sounding not too bad in its own right, is definitely a downgrade from the original version. I still think personally that Legends is the way to go, since there's been some touch-ups on the graphics and character models alongside some tweaks to EXP and encounter rates. Another aspect that I really respect about Skies of Arcadia is that during this generation, JRPGs were evolving quickly with a push to 3D with larger scopes and visions. Whilst this led to some of the best JRPGs being made at the time, I can't help but notice that unlike the generation before it with the Super Nintendo, there was a push for more darker and mature releases. These games are great in their own right, but looking back, Skies of Arcadia was definitely a breath of fresh air with its more optimistic and bright tone compared to other JRPGs that were being released at the time. Sometimes you just need that more uplifting and cheerful title. It's an aspect of this game that I really appreciated whilst playing. This isn't me attacking other JRPGs from the 6th generation of consoles, they're great in their own right. But I just find that Skies of Arcadia was doing something more original and reminding us that JRPGs can be many different experiences. You really can't get more original than playing as a sky pirate of all things as you explore this vast and at the time graphically impressive world. One last miscellaneous point that I'd like to bring up is the way that Skies of Arcadia goes about its world map. Unlike every other JRPG that was out at the time, which pretty much had the same viewed out perspective on a mostly green plane, Skies of Arcadia is much more detailed and has elevation when it comes to its world map. Despite having similar technical limitations, this title uses its setting in a clever way to its advantage. And it does all this by having an in-universe reason as to why all these areas are isolated from one another in the first place, by having the game being set in the sky where the isolated environments make sense. So yeah, long story short, I'm not a big fan of how every PlayStation 1 JRPG has the same world map. Unfortunately, despite its strong critical reception and cult following, Skies of Arcadia underperformed commercially, with there being no concrete sales numbers that I could find, which is never a good thing. Some online resources point towards this title selling less than $250,000, which is honestly a little heartbreaking when you consider just how much effort and passion was put into Skies of Arcadia. This is hands down one of the biggest injustices in gaming history. Skies of Arcadia had all the hallmarks of a masterpiece back when it first came out. Sega was doing everything that they could to stay afloat in the console market by developing some of the best games that the generation had to offer. But unfortunately, we all know how this story ends, and sadly it was not meant to be. Skies of Arcadia suffered heavily by not only its timing of release but also by the fact that it came out on a dying system. Even when it came around to giving this title its second chance on the GameCube, that console at the time was Nintendo's worst selling home system, with its user base being not that different from what the Dreamcast had. Also, most JRPGs were released at the time exclusively on the PlayStation 2, so it would have made more sense to release the port on that console, which was originally the plan, but the PS2 port was cancelled during the development of Legends. What hurts me the most about Skies of Arcadia's unfortunate sales is something regarding this game's ending. Real quick, if you'd like to avoid spoilers, please skip to this timestamp on screen. So the ending of this game is exactly what you'd want from a feel-good adventure like this. After saving the day, Vice, Ica and Fina, who is now supporting a whole new pirate get-up alongside Cooper, this is beyond cute by the way, sail off into the great unknown. And the final text you see before the game ends states, as long as there is first to discover the unknown, there will be stories to tell and new adventures to be had. In retrospect, there is something very melancholic about this ending, since they absolutely had bigger plans for this game to turn it into a series. I can only imagine what a sequel would have looked like. Apparently, there was one planned for an unknown system that entered the early planning stages during the 6th generation of consoles. However, the team that was developing Sakura Wars 5 needed additional help and resources to get the game out, so more developers were put onto that project. After finishing off production on that title, plans for the sequel to Skies of Arcadia ultimately fizzled out and the project was cancelled. As someone who has played Sakura Wars 5 fairly recently, a crazy coincidence that is, I would say it's an alright experience. But I can't say that I wouldn't trade this game for Skies of Arcadia 2 because I feel like a sequel to Skies would have been a much better decision in my opinion. That being said, it makes sense business wise to double down on the development of Sakura Wars 5 since at the time the series was huge in Japan, not so much in the West, but a lot of JRPGs was like that back in the day. So investing in a project that is already fairly popular just makes sense over taking another financial risk. However, despite the Sakura Wars series being massive in Japan, Sakura Wars 5 performed terribly financially and was the worst selling game in the series at that point in time. Hindsight is always 2020 with these retrospect style videos. Regardless, despite its unfortunate circumstances and history of only being released less than 1 year before the discontinuation of the Sega Dreamcast, I'm still grateful that Skies of Arcadia even came out when you consider just how many odds were stacked against it back in the day. It's a miracle this game even came out in the shape that it did when you consider the circumstances against it. This is one of the best JRPGs out there, and whilst there isn't anything else to quite scratch that same itch, I'd very much recommend Skies of Arcadia if you're looking for a JRPG truly unlike any other. It's a masterpiece in the modern day. Unfortunately, second-hand copies are fairly pricey online, and with no official re-release in sight outside of some vague headlines implying such, I recommend playing this game in whichever way you can. I mean, it's a game all about pirating, what more is there to say here? But now, I'm curious, what do you think about this forgotten title? Did you play it back in the day, or are you like me and have only recently just experienced it for the first time? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.